This is the Bethany Baptist Podcast Network, and now today's message. So today we're going to pick up where we left off last week, which is talking about redeeming love and redeeming sex. It's about walking wisely in relationships. Now, as a reminder, for those that missed last week, we were streaming online only last week, but for those that missed last week, last week and today are going to be slightly more adult in content. Matter of fact, like I said last week, I say again this week, if I had to give it a rating, I would probably rate our sermon probably around a PG-13 rating. Okay, the goal is not to be gross, it's not to be graphic, but it's to be honest. And if you want to know why we have to be honest about this conversation, I highly encourage going back and listening to last week's sermon. Because I believe it was 6 or 7 different reasons why this topic has to be talked about and why the church absolutely cannot balk at talking about this, that it is essential. So we're going to pick up where we left off. And so in the 1960s, there was a man by the name of Frank Abagnale Jr., or Frank Abagnale Jr., who pulled off some of the most elaborate scams in U.S. history. Matter of fact, some of you may be familiar with this story from the movie Catch Me If You Can, directed by Steven Spielberg, starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks. Also spun off into a Broadway musical called Catch Me If You Can. Both of those are based off of Frank's book called Catch Me If You Can. And it's all about the scams and the con that Frank pulled in his early adult years. Frank was a con artist. Now, for those that aren't aware, the term con is actually short for a longer term, which is confidence trick. So a con is a confidence trick. And the whole idea behind a con or a confidence trick is to gain the trust of another person simply for the sake of defrauding them later. To defraud them by first building up trust with them. So you take the character of who they are, because people want to be trusting people. At the heart of who we are, we want to be trusting people. We want to give the benefit of the doubt to people. And so it takes their character and uses it against them, so to speak, so that you build their trust only to be able to deceive them and exploit them later. So that is who Frank was in his early years. Understand something. The vast majority, actually the majority of the cons that Frank pulled off all occurred by the time he was 21 years old. By the time he was 21 years old, he started at 15 years old. His first con was toward his father, where his dad would give him his credit card and he would go and purchase a bunch of things, then turn around and go to the store and say, I want to sell it back to you. I need to turn it back, but instead of putting it back on the card, I'd like the cash. And so by doing that with his father's credit card at 15 years old, he ended up conning his father for a couple $1,000s, which in today's money estimates to be somewhere between $30,000 and $40,000 is what he ended up conning out of his father. When he became 16, the game changed. And he said, if I can do that with a credit card, what else can I do with these gifts and talents that I have? And so the game changes at 16 years old, and he starts to learn how to forge documents and forge paperwork. And by the time he was 21 years old, from 16 to 18, he lived under 8 different aliases and identities. 8 different aliases and identities. He worked in 8 different major career fields and scammed each one of them. The first one, at 16 years old, he was an airline pilot. And he went to Pan American Airlines and said, I need a pilot's uniform. And they said, why do you need a pilot's uniform? He says, because I'm a pilot, and the dry cleaner lost my uniform. I need a new one. They said, oh, okay, so here's your pilot's uniform. He then forged a pilot's license, a badge for Pan American Airlines saying that he was an employee. He did all of that just so he could wear the uniform to the bank with the forged checks, payroll checks that he made from Pan American Airlines to pay himself. So he wore the uniform, brought his Pan American IDs and credentials and his pilot's license to the bank just so he could cash fake payroll checks. Then he realized there's a program called deadheading between airlines that you can catch a flight on your own flight or on a partnering airline to be able to fly to a different destination so that pilots could eventually they could get to the hub they needed so they could fly out and do their jobs. So it's called deadheading. You get to fly for free. He realized that this was a perk of being a pilot. Why not give this a try? And so he ended up deadheading on various different flights. Matter of fact, Pan American Airlines, he did this pilot gig for 2 years, from 16 to 18 years old. Pan Am, by the time they found out what was going on, they estimate that he flew over 1 million miles on over 250 different flights to 26 different countries. But that's not it for the pilot story. On top of that, because he was deadheading and he's a pilot, as he was sitting on flights, it wasn't uncommon for one of the pilots to come out and talk to him and say, hey, listen, I need to stretch my legs. I need to go get something to drink. I need to go do whatever. Can you take the controls? He can barely drive a car. And they hand the control of the airplane to him, and it scared him to death. He said, not only am I responsible for 140 lives, but my own included. He said, in his book, he said, I can't even fly a kite, let alone an airplane. So he would go to the controls, and he would take over the controls, and he would automatically hit autopilot and let it cruise. After that, it wasn't long. It took a couple years, but they started to figure out what was going on. So Frank left being a pilot. Then he went and forged a degree, a medical degree, and a medical license, and went into the field of being a doctor. Because if it wasn't risky enough being a pilot, why not go into the life of being a doctor? And so he starts to parade around as a doctor and ended up at a hospital that actually gave him authority. And he ended up not just serving as a doctor, but actually was put in charge of overseeing the education of interns without a medical license, having never practiced. And then after he started to get found out there, left. And you think that one of those catches would have been enough? A second one, maybe? No, he did it 8 times. Another one that he ended up going into was law. I'm going to beat the law and hide within the law. And then on top of it, he also appeared before judges as a fake lawyer arguing cases. He forged a degree from Harvard Law. But the crazy thing is, he did this at 19 years old. Here's the craziest part. He did this in Louisiana. But the craziest part was, they always said, how in the world, you conned a lot of things, but you can't con the Bar Association. How did you con the Bar Association? And eventually he said, I didn't. I actually went and took the bar and I passed it. Without a law degree, passed the Louisiana bar exam at 19 years old. Frank did this 8 different times, but was eventually caught. He served time in prison in France, in Switzerland. Switzerland, come on. If you end up in jail in Switzerland, just saying, okay? In France, in Switzerland, and the U.S. But here's the thing. In the U.S., he was serving time at a federal prison. He was sentenced to 12 years. But after 5 years, the government said, well, wait a minute. We have this talented man sitting in our jail cells. He might actually be a resource. How about we reduce your sentence? Like, you're going to serve out the 12 years, but what if instead of sitting in a cell, what if you come work with us? And you help us catch other scam artists and con artists and paper hangers and document forgers. Why don't you come work for us? And he goes, jail cell, work with the government. Jail cell, work with the government. No brainer. So he goes and he works for the government. But here's the thing. As talented as he was, as unbelievable as those stories are, because it's kind of fun to talk about now. I don't think I'd laugh as much if I was one of the people on the airplane, or I found out that my doctor had no degree and he was sitting there teaching other future doctors how to be a doctor, and none of them know what they're doing. I don't think I laugh at those points. But now when we get to see it in a Hollywood movie, it kind of romanticizes the story and it makes it a little bit better. But here's the thing. In real life, at some point, a pilot interacting with real pilots, it doesn't take long for the real pilots to go, wait a minute, something's not right. A doctor, a fake doctor, a counterfeit doctor hanging around real doctors, it doesn't take long for the real doctors to go, wait a minute, something isn't right. A lawyer hanging around other lawyers, they go, wait a minute. Matter of fact, it was a paralegal, if I remember right, that actually caught on and went, wait a minute, there's something not right with this lawyer. Because the reality is this: he wasn't real in any of those fields. He was a counterfeit. He was a fraud. And it didn't take long for people to be able to smell fake. A counterfeit is a cheap imitation of something real. It's a cheap imitation of something that's real. And to most people, a counterfeit looks real. It looks real, but it isn't. And the purpose of something counterfeit is to be able to deceive, steal, or destroy. It promises something that's good. It promises something that's true, but it's a hollow promise because in the end, it's not worth the paper it's written on, so to speak. Take money, for example. Counterfeit money, if I handed you, if you had the option of having $1 million counterfeit or $10 real, knowing that it's counterfeit, which are you going to pick? $10. Why? Because you know at least you get $10 out of it. $1 million fake dollars is about the equivalent if you walk around with $1 million Monopoly dollars. It doesn't matter. It doesn't add up to anything because it's counterfeit. It's not real. You know that the promise that's guaranteed with the $10 is far more valuable than the promises that are written on the millions because they're not real. Counterfeits are cheap imitations. They're hollow promises. They have the appearance of something good, but in the end they're fake and they never deliver on their promises. They're not worth the promises. And today we have to understand that the chief knockoff artist of all time, the con artist of all time, the chief scam artist of all time is Satan. And anything that God has made good, real, true, Satan is counterfeited. And there is a cheap imitation that goes with what God has made to be real. Satan, his con, if you will, his confidence trick is to gain our trust. It's to gain our trust so that ultimately he might lead us as the created away from the one that who created us. So it's to lead the created from the creator. And his chief confidence trick is to deceive us, to steal from us, to rob from us the good things that God has given. And the way he does that, he does this a number of different ways. First of all, he does this by leading you to believe that God isn't good or trustworthy. That God isn't as good or trustworthy as he says he is. Because if he can cast a shadow of doubt in your eyes or in your mind about who God is, it's not going to be easy for you to say, well, if God's not real, then what is? And what can I go after that's going to deliver on real? So he wants to defraud us by leading us to believe that God isn't as good or trustworthy as he says he is. Number two, he wants you to believe that God's gifts and his plans aren't as good as God says they are. That God's plans, that God's gifts are really cheap imitations is what Satan wants you to believe. But if you want the real thing, you got to come to me. Because God's only going to give you a little bit. The real stuff, the good stuff. You know, the stuff that's in the back closet, in the back room, I've got all that. And if he can get us to believe that, we'd be willing to walk away from anything to have what we think would be real. But it's a con. Number three, that God's gifts aren't enough. That no matter what God gives you, it'll never satisfy you. That it'll never satisfy you and that you're going to need more. His first con was with Adam and Eve in the garden. And he gets Eve to believe all of these three things. He gets Eve to believe that, number one, God isn't as trustworthy as he says he is. That God held back from her and her husband. That he gave her everything except for one thing. So therefore, if he didn't give me that one thing, what else is he holding out on? So maybe God isn't as trustworthy. Satan gets her he leads her to believe that the word of God, that his word isn't true. Secondly, that God's gifts aren't good. They're limited. And also leads her to believe that she and her husband are never going to find real satisfaction under the rule of God because God put a rule in place. And all he wants to do is limit you under a bunch of rules. It was one rule. But all she could see was that one rule, and she couldn't see all the good things that God actually had laid out for her. And he said, don't eat from this one tree. And she went, well, now I'm not satisfied because Satan tells me, the serpent's telling me that if I eat there, that's where real satisfaction is going to be. And that's what God told me I can't have. So now I want it. And he tells her that she's never going to find satisfaction under God's rule, that they're going to have to carve their own path for happiness if they really want to find happiness. That the marriage that God has given them is not going to be enough. That the work that he gave them is not going to be good enough. That the education that they have isn't going to be good enough. They're going to need more, right? Tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? He tells them that the church life that they have, the worship that God has given them isn't going to be enough. They're going to have to make it more exciting. That they're going to have to carve their own path to happiness. So Eve buys the lie, hook, line, and sinker, tells her husband buys her lies, hook, line, and sinker, because she's believing the lie of the serpent. They eat and the whole world falls. And it brought the opposite of everything that they hoped for, because the promises the serpent made turned out to be frauds, phonies, counterfeits. They didn't deliver. Because instead of drawing them closer to God, because he says, listen, you'll be like God. It didn't bring them closer to God. It actually divided them from him. And just like a child, when a child gets caught, right, and a parent catches a child doing something, the child typically doesn't run to the parent and say, let me tell you everything I did wrong. Instead, when a child does something wrong, the first thing they do is they run. What is the first thing that Adam and Eve do? They run. They hide. They try to cover their tracks. And then they lied. So it didn't draw them closer to God. It actually drew them farther from him. Instead of drawing them closer together in their marriage, it actually divided them against one another. So instead of talking lovingly of each other, they began to blame one another. It's your fault. No, it's your fault. God, it's your fault that you gave her to me. And instead of making their future family stronger, because they were probably sitting around like two lovebirds writing the names of their future children, probably not on paper, but on a tree somewhere, carving it in. We can't wait to have these kids, and we're going to name them such and such, such and such. We're going to have such a beautiful family one day. We can't wait for that. But instead of having a strong future family, their children grow up fighting for attention and craving attention and needing more and more and more, just like their mother did. And just like their father did, to the point where one takes the life of the other. So everything that was promised through the serpent to give life actually brought the opposite. It brought death to every meaningful relationship that they craved. It was a counterfeit promise. And when I don't think that Adam and Eve ever looked at the decision they made, they look back on it and say, well, at least something good came out of it. I don't think they ever looked at the decision they made and said, it's been hard, but I'm glad we've landed where we landed. Because I think that the reality is once they saw the promises that Satan had made to them turned out to be hollow, and the happiness that he promised were just cheap imitations, that they weren't real, they looked at what they had with God in comparison with what they ended up with Satan and realized they were conned and that it was too late at that point. And they were stuck. Satan is the chief con artist that ever has been. And the first war that he waged was on marriage, God's institution. And it's the same one that he's waging even today. Because marriage is God's institution that he gave people to be able to find intimacy, to be able to find sexual pleasure, to be able to find satisfaction, to be able to find companionship, friendship, and to be able to journey with somebody meaningfully in a meaningful relationship as they worship God together. They don't worship each other, but they worship God together. But today, instead of looking for pleasure and satisfaction in the things that God has made and given, instead what we do today, just like Adam and Eve did in the garden, we don't create new things here, right? We're creatures of habit. And the same thing that Adam and Eve did are the same things that we do even today. That we look at pleasure and satisfaction, and we look at the way that God promises us, and we question God's character. Well, is he really going to deliver that? We look at his gifts and we say, are they really going to be that good? You know what? I don't think marriage is that good. That's why Christians sit around and they joke about spouses all the time. And no wonder single people aren't rushing to get married when married people talk about their spouses the way they do. Because we question the character and the promises of God, the one who's offering real satisfaction. And instead, what we do today is just like Adam and Eve, we settle for cheap imitations. And that's what Solomon is warning his son about in Proverbs chapter 5, which we read most of it last week. And I skipped a certain section, so we're going to come back to that this week. But in Proverbs chapter 5, Solomon is contrasting two relationships. The first one we talked about last week, which is God's plan and gift for people, which is marriage. We saw that in verses 15 through 20, right? It's where we're going to find hashtag relationship goals. It's where if you want to be able to find that relationship that's going to deliver, it's not going to be perfect. Understand that. God's never offering a perfect relationship. We believe that in the garden. But it's going to be the best available where we're going to be able to grow together, love together, and to be able to find intimacy and pleasure and joy. It's going to be in marriage. And we see that in verses 15 through 20. It's a monogamous relationship, a God-centered relationship. It's called marriage. It's between one man and one woman, and it's where sexual passions and desires are discovered, they're explored, they're practiced, all in the safety and the sanctity of marriage. And then the other one he contrasts it with is a cheap imitation or a counterfeit relationship. In other words, anything else other than marriage, where we're trying to find relational or sexual satisfaction. Anything else. It's a wayward relationship is what Solomon calls it. It looks good, it sounds good, it appears enticing, but it ultimately will never deliver. And so we're going to look at Proverbs 5, verses 3 through 14. We're going to kind of break it up here in just a moment. But like we said last week, understand something. Sex is not evil. It's not shameful. It might be slightly awkward to talk about, especially in church, but we've got to move past that. Because the reality is, it might be awkward for Christians to talk about in church, but it hasn't become awkward enough that they don't watch it in movies, listen to it in music, search for it on the internet, read about it in books or romance novels, that they don't joke about it with their friends. And the funny, not funny part is it hasn't stopped Christians. Instead of the world coming to the church and saying, hey, what does God say about marriage, sex, and relationships? Instead of the world coming and saying, we need to know what God has created for us. Instead, the church who knows what God created is going to the world and saying, teach us all about it. We have the real thing, but we're going somewhere else and saying, teach us about the cheap imitation. So that we can do what you're doing instead of following what God has created for us. Understand the desires that people have. This is something we don't talk about enough, but the desires that people have for love and sex and intimacy and curiosity, they are legitimate desires. There is nothing wrong for a young person who has a desire to be married and to have sex. And I tell them that all the time. It is a legitimate desire that God has put inside of you. It is not shameful. It is not hurtful. It is not wrong. The problem comes when we seek to explore those legitimate desires in illegitimate ways. That's where the problem sets in. When we seek to explore those legitimate desires in illegitimate ways. And that's what Solomon is warning his son about. Verses 3 and 4. He says this, though the lips of the forbidden woman, they drip honey, and her words are smoother than oil. In the end, she's as bitter as wormwood, and as sharp as a double-edged sword. Again, let me give a little context to remind you. Solomon is writing a letter to his son. The problem is not with the woman. The problem is not with women. It is not elevating men above women and saying, women are from the devil. That's a joke that our culture likes to talk about. But that's not what is being said here by Solomon. He's writing a letter to his son. He's not saying that the woman or women are problems. What he's saying is the problem is the relationship. But he's doing it in the context, he's personifying the relationship as a woman. He's talking about it. He's saying, listen, she looks good. She talks good. She says enticing things. She promises pleasure. She promises satisfaction. In other words, this looks like relationship goals. You're looking at her going, she may be the one, Dad. But I'm telling you, son, she is not. A counterfeit always looks good on the surface. They promise good things, but it's in the end that they cannot deliver. In the end, the relationship turns out to be like wormwood. Verse 4, like wormwood, or sharp as a double-edged sword. Wormwood is a bitter shrub that's often eaten by goats. And in that time, people also ate to treat intestinal parasites. Wormwood is also the name of the star in Revelation 8, that when the third trumpet blows, wormwood is the star that's going to fall. It's going to land in the water sources. It's going to contaminate a third of the water on the earth, and anyone who drinks from it will die. So what Solomon is telling his son in these two verses is he's telling his son that this relationship will not satisfy you, and for you to pursue it is like drinking judgment on yourself. It's like drinking judgment on yourself. And when he says that she's as sharp as a double-edged sword, if you're to translate that literally, it means that she has many mouths. She has multiple mouths, which means that essentially if you pursue this relationship will devour you. Verse 5, it says that it'll actually lead you to Sheol, to the grave. To the grave. So finding relationship goals is the heartbeat of what Solomon is trying to lead his son toward, to be able to find honest, satisfying, real, God-honoring relationships. And they have three parts to it. That a God-honoring relationship, right, is a covenant-making relationship. That, in other words, the Bible uses words like union and unity. But a covenant-making relationship is seeking to be bound to real, good, or God-honoring things in a relationship. A marriage is a covenant. A covenant is an unending promise. It's an unending promise. Husband and wife, when they join together and when they sleep together, it's a physical demonstration of two becoming one flesh. There is a deep, deep meaning behind that. That is a covenant-making act. And that when it happens, it's two people saying that it's just us from now on. So when we do that and we have multiple partners, we're trying to make ourselves one flesh with a lot of different people. But that marriage is meant to be a covenant-making relationship. And that's what we talked about in verses 15 through 20 last week. That's how you walk in wisdom, is to pursue a covenant-making type of relationship. It's also covenant-keeping, where you fight to preserve biblical relationships. In other words, you fight to stay bound together. It's not being stuck together. It's not looking at your spouse saying, well, I guess we're stuck together. Here's the next 60 years. But it's being instead, how beautiful does this sound? Freely bound. It's being freely bound to one another. I bind myself to you. And the wife looks at me and she says, and I bind myself to you. We are freely bound. I choose you. It's fighting for that. Part of relationship goals, also the third part of it, is that it also has to be covenant rejecting. That it has to refuse to be bound to wrong things or cheap imitations. And that's the whole point of verses 3 through 14. It's avoiding, rejecting, denying anything outside of God's good plans and God's good gifts. And that's exactly what Solomon is telling his son in verses 7 and 8. He says, so now sons, notice it changes, goes from son to sons. He's talking to his kids. Don't turn away from the words from my mouth. Listen to me, boy. Listen to me, sons. Don't turn away from my words. Instead, you need to keep far away from her. Don't even go near the door of her house. In other words, son, run. Don't look at her. Don't look at this relationship and say, don't worry, I can handle this. Don't look at that relationship and say, you know what, it's not going to affect me. Don't look at the relationship and say, you know what, let me at least try and see what happens. Because you know what, maybe it didn't work out for all the other people and all the other stories that you got, but you know that what they don't have me. And I can handle it, and I can do it. As if I'm going to be the one in history that's going to break the cycle. And what Solomon is telling his son is, no. Run. Run from cheap imitations that say they want to satisfy like sex and marriage can, that God has given, but they are cheap imitations. Run from those things. Run from the cheap imitations like sex outside of marriage or living together outside of marriage, which, by the way, is just counterfeit marriage. That when you live together with somebody outside of marriage, all it is saying we want to share the bed, the bills, and the responsibilities, but we don't want the covenant. It's a counterfeit marriage. Run from pornography culture. Run from redefining dating, marriage, and sex to any other standard apart from God's. Reject these things. Be a covenant rejecter. Do not bind yourself to these things. Instead, hold on to the promises and the gifts that God has for you. Because I promise you, they are better, is what Solomon is telling his son, is what God is telling us. God tells us to run from these cheap imitations. Why? What makes them so wrong or harmful? Number one, when we pursue after counterfeits, when we pursue after these cheap imitations, we miss the real purpose and satisfaction of love the way that God created love. We totally miss it. We think we got it. We think it feels good because it does feel good for a season. Doesn't all sin feel good for a season? It feels good for a season, but in the end it doesn't deliver. And understand this, cheap imitations come with cheap fun. Cheap imitations come with cheap fun, but real love and real satisfaction, they take sacrifice and work. They are not cheap, but they are worth it. They are not cheap. The real thing is not cheap. It's costly, but it's worth it. Second reason why we have to reject these things, counterfeit relationships and practices, they can bring worlds of conflict, issues, and hurts to our world. They can affect our emotional health. We wanted to feel full and satisfied, but instead we feel empty. We can feel anxious, worried, constantly wondering, is this what it's supposed to be like? If it's so wonderful, then why do I feel so hurt? It can affect our physical health because if we're worried about something, doesn't our emotional health tend to have physical effects on our body? Have you ever been worried about something and you can't sleep? Have you ever been worried about something you can't eat? It takes a toll on the person that you are because our emotional health is intimately bound with our physical health. It can have effects on our spiritual health, where we start to question God, or we walk away from God, or we're unable to worship together with our spouse because we have bound ourselves with somebody who they might say, I like God or I love God, but they really don't want to have any part of Him. So the reality is you can't really worship together. And it starts to affect your spiritual health. It can have adverse effects on your spiritual walk. It can have effects on your financial health. Especially if it doesn't work out and you start having to involve lawyers. Gets a little expensive. You lose years because you dedicate time to building something that was unable to stand. In verse 9 and 11, that it comes with the why, right? Solomon tells them, this is why you need to avoid counterfeits. It's because otherwise you will give up your vitality to others and your years to someone cruel. Strangers, in other words, people who have no intention of being bound in marriage. That's what he means by stranger. We talked about it last week in verse 17. Strangers, people have no intention of being bound in the good things that God has given. They'll drain your resources and your hard-earned pay, and they'll end up in a foreigner's house. And at the end of your life, you'll lament when your physical body has been consumed. Because another effect that comes from counterfeit relationships is that it can bring grief, guilt, shame, and regret. Regret. That's what Solomon tells his son in verse 12. He says, son, you pursue this and understand there's going to be a time when you look and you're going to say how I hated discipline and how my heart, it despised correction. I didn't walk in wisdom, Dad. You told me and I knew it and I saw it and I didn't walk in wisdom. I turned my back to discipline. Like we've talked about all these weeks with wisdom. What is wisdom? That discipline is acting on that which we know to be wise. And he says in verse 12, how my heart despised correction, discipline. I didn't obey my teachers or listen closely to my instructors. I am on the verge now of complete ruin before the entire community. Dad, I should have listened. I saw the red flags and I ignored them. We thought in our relationship, you know what, if we just have sex, then maybe. If we just live together, then maybe. If we just have a kid, then maybe. If this person just gets this job, then maybe. but it was a cheap imitation. And what's interesting, the one that's writing this proverb and the one that's telling his son about walking in wisdom and relationships lived a life of doing the opposite. That Solomon wrote this letter, King Solomon, and by the end of his life, he was known to have had 700 wives, 300 women in waiting, concubines. That's a direct violation of God's plan for love, sex, and marriage. But when he writes about love in Proverbs, when he writes about love in the Bible, he writes and teaches the opposite of what his life lived. That as he writes in the Song of Solomon, he writes this beautiful, and to be honest with you, erotic story about the wife of his youth. Not about 700 women. He writes about the wife of his youth and how beautiful she was and how meaningful she was. In Proverbs, it's almost like he's telling his son, son, don't be like me. Because at the end of his life, when he writes Ecclesiastes, he says, listen, I had everything. I had money, I had women, I had power, I had prestige, but in the end, I was never satisfied. 700 wives, 300 concubines, and I was never satisfied. I spent my life chasing the wind. So as you read Proverbs 5, it's hard not to read it as a warning from a father who isn't getting it right to a son begging him, be better, be different. And that's why he closes Proverbs chapter 5 with verses 20 through 23 where he says, why, my son, why? Why would you lose yourself with a forbidden woman and embrace a wayward woman? A wrong relationship. Because a man's ways are before the Lord's eyes always, and he considers all of his paths. A wicked man's iniquities, his sin, will trap him. He will become tangled in the ropes of his own sin. Notice he doesn't say in the decisions of the woman. He says in his own sin. Because at the end of the day, we're responsible for the decisions we make and the relationships that we enter into. And it wasn't the woman's fault. It was his for entering into a relationship that he shouldn't have entered into. And he became entangled in his own sin. And in verse 23, he says that he will die because there is no discipline and be lost because of his great stupidity. Wow. How we view and interact with our sexual relationships matters. Andrew Lucado says it like this, that the truth is sex affects you, and sexual sin has its own set of consequences that can follow you like no other. It will keep you in an unhealthy relationship. It will prevent you from entering a healthy relationship, and it will cause unnecessary shame. So whether you're here today and you're young or old, married, single, divorced, widowed, understand that this is a message for everybody. What are the cheap imitations that you are settling for in your life right now? Because I promise you, all of us are. Even if you're married, you may be in a married relationship and saying, listen, it's great. It's good, but there are cheap imitations within your marriage. Perhaps instead of loving your spouse, you worship them. Another word for that is you're codependent. That you feel like anytime your spouse is away, that you've lost your way or your place. What are the cheap imitations that you're settling for in your life right now? What are the counterfeit relationships or practices or thoughts that you're embracing right now that God is calling you to walk away from? What covenants are you making right now that you ought to be rejecting? That you ought to be rejecting? Which ones are you rejecting that perhaps you should be working and praying and fighting to keep? That you're saying, you know what, I'm just done. This isn't happy. This isn't what I thought would be happy, and I'm just done. But God's called you into a covenant, and you're there, and He's saying, no, don't give up. Keep fighting. How is God the center of your world right now? Because I promise you The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. It's the beginning of wisdom. It's the beginning of the wisdom that you're seeking to walk in your relationships. And if we build our house on any other foundation other than that of God, we build and labor in vain. That is what the Bible tells us. We build and labor in vain. And so where is God in your story right now? Where are you in His story, more importantly? And what is God calling you to do right now? How is He calling you to turn to Him and trust Him right now when everything seems like I can do everything but trust God? That right now you kind of feel like Adam and Eve and you go, I just don't know if I can. But you can. Because I promise the whispers that you're listening to right now are lies from the best con artist that's ever been. And there's a God that loves you. He wants to redeem the love that's in your life. He wants to redeem you. Even if you've made mistakes, He wants to be able to redeem those so that you might find newness of life with Him. And that is the gospel. That is the truth. Let's pray together. Father, we come before You needing You right now. God, asking that You would bring wholeness to our relationships. Father, where there are marriages that are struggling right now, God, I pray that You would intervene in ways that we don't even know how to ask. Lord, for the wife that's tired and she just wants to walk away, or the husband that's just tired and he wants to walk away, give them the audacity of faith, maybe not to trust their spouse or to trust themselves, but to trust You and to keep fighting. For those that are on the outskirts of a relationship and they're trying to decide, should this go to the next level? And they're looking at it going, I don't know if I could or should. Help them look with wisdom at this relationship. Is this a covenant-making relationship? One that wants to bring honor and glory to God? Or self-glorification to myself? Where I just want to feel good about myself? God, help them to be able to identify the relationship that they need to be in and whether this relationship needs to become that next step. Not to run away from marriage, not to date for 5 years or 10 years, Lord, and live in a counterfeit relationship, but instead to make difficult decisions, because love is not cheap. It's costly, but it's worth it to make those decisions, to choose one another well. God, give us the courage to choose You above all things, because without You, all of this is in vain. Every single thing. Give us the courage to trust You, to need You, to depend on You, to turn to You, to walk with You, to walk in You, and to share You with others, Father, that we might walk in transformed lives. We pray this in Your name. Amen. Thanks for listening with us today. To learn more about our church, go to wearebethany.com.